Ben Northrop was sitting at a tech conference listening to a presentation about a new piece of technology when he was struck by the sense that history was repeating itself. For the 20 years that Ben has worked as a software engineer, he's been hearing about new technologies that claim they will be able to disrupt everything. And Ben has been relentlessly keeping up with the latest trends as much as he possibly can. And of course, Ben is like all of us. Nobody can keep up. As a daily software podcaster, I think I'm as well positioned as anybody to be tuned into the wide breadth of the software engineering ecosystem. But I am constantly behind as well. I can never keep up with all of the information and the new technologies that are being developed. And Ben reflects on this in his post, Reflections of an Old Programmer. In this post, Ben theorized about the causes of his feelings of fatigue and the constant struggle that we all have to keep up with the world of software engineering. His post contains enduring lessons that will be of value both to new programmers and it will feel familiar to programmers who have been around for a while. It was a real pleasure to talk to Ben about his experiences over the last 20 years as a programmer and the philosophies that he encapsulated in this post, Reflections of an Old Programmer. I think you'll like it too. Continuous integration gives you faster, safer software delivery. With a continuous integration tool like Snap CI from ThoughtWorks, the members of your team can push changes independently of each other, and they can all see their new builds running against different phases of tests before those changes make their way into production. The fastest moving companies that I've talked to on Software Engineering Daily are all using continuous integration. Snap CI from ThoughtWorks is available to anyone. And if you go to snap.ci/software engineering daily, you can check it out for yourself and support Software Engineering Daily. With just a few clicks, I had my own continuous integration set up for some projects that were just sitting in my GitHub account without continuous integration. I got continuous integration up quite easily using Snap CI. If you want to be that hero at your company that starts moving your organization towards deploying often, more confidently, towards that DevOps dream, start working with Snap CI at snap.ci/software engineering daily. Your coworkers will see you working with Snap CI and they will fall in love with it themselves. Oftentimes it takes somebody at a bigger company to go out on their own and say, okay, I'm going to roll out CI even though nobody else at the company is using it. And maybe that hero at the company is going to be you. So check out snap.ci/software engineering daily. And thanks to ThoughtWorks for being a continued sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. It really means a lot. Ben Northrop is the author of the blog post Reflections of an Old Programmer. Ben, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Hey, thanks very much for having me.
You're 40 years old, right?
Just about, a couple months shy.
So it's funny that you refer to yourself as an old programmer, but I think the main point you were making in your post was that after about 20 years in the industry, you started to notice certain cyclical aspects of being a programmer. And your post began with you at a tech conference, and you were learning about React Native at this tech conference, and you describe sitting in the audience of a presentation. You're listening to people talking about how this new technology, React Native, is going to disrupt everything, and you describe yourself feeling fatigued rather than thrilled and excited about React Native. You felt like you'd been through this before. It's an introduction of yet another new piece of incremental technology. Where did that sense of fatigue come from?
That's a good question. So, I've been to, conferences. I've been doing this. I've been in software for, almost 20 years now. And I've gone to conferences and I try to go to meetups here and there. And in general, when I go to these things, I feel more energized and inspired. And for whatever reason on this day, yeah, I guess I wasn't feeling well, or I wasn't, stuff was going on at home, and it was a Saturday morning. And I think also because I've kind of missed the train on mobile technologies, and I'm definitely out of the loop. I've focused more kind of in the web and kind of the back end. So I felt that there's kind of a bigger gap between what I knew and kind of the React Native and the stuff I was learning about. And I think I just felt, I was just speaking honestly, I just felt, oh man, I am so, I've been in this industry for 20 years, and I'm still at a point where that I can feel so behind. And so, kind of, I guess just so behind.
Well, that is one of the great, not great in a like positive term, but it's just one of the interesting aspects of computer science, of programming, is that it feels like the scope of what's going on in the industry is always expanding, and it's getting harder and harder to keep up. I mean, I am a software podcaster, and I do 5 shows a week on totally disparate topics, and and all I do is scratch the surface. I don't even go deep on these topics, and I'm constantly behind. So, I mean, did your feelings at the conference, did it contrast with younger people? Did those younger people feel like they were more excited, or they had the right base of knowledge to take advantage of React Native, for example? Or what was the difference between yourself and the younger people at the conference?
So I think, that's another good question. I think I've thought about this a bit, and I think on one hand, experience, in 20 years in software, you've seen a lot of things come and go, and so 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I might have had maybe a little more excitement because I thought this would be it. There'd be a little more longevity in it, and at almost 40, because I've seen so many things kind of come and go, I feel like maybe this is just yet another new thing. Maybe not necessarily a bandwagon with React Native, but this is just yet another new technology. And in a couple of years, it may not be around. And I think the other thing is, kind of getting into the other aspect of the post, which is it's not necessarily the learning of new technologies, because I think every programmer really loves to learn, and it is exciting to pick up new things, but it's also kind of the displacement of the stuff that you knew before, right? So you've, with enough experience, you can think back to 10 years or 5 years before when you learned a whole lot about some other framework, and the industry has changed, and all that knowledge, all that energy you sunk into learning that framework isn't useful anymore. And so you kind of have to gear up and kind of discard what you knew before, and kind of go on a new journey, and you're pretty much at the same point that everyone else is. Regardless of how long they've been in the industry, there's really no advantage. And I think this is debatable, and this is probably something that we could talk about, but there's not quite as much advantage maybe as you'd expect for a 40-year-old programmer getting to React Native versus a 30-year-old or versus a 25-year-old, if a lot of the concepts are new. And sure, there are, of course, and again, we can kind of talk about this, there's probably basic patterns and things, and some of my experience can help me maybe jumpstart me to kind of understand the bigger picture. But when I'm thinking, I'm listening to React Native and their terminology, flex boxes, and frameworks like Pepperoni. I mean, none of my experience 10 years ago makes me understand what Pepperoni is. So
yeah, although you could argue that the meta of you recognizing that your other experiences don't necessarily translate well to this, that in itself is an advantage. I also think about you compare, in this post you compared programming to other industries like medicine, for example, and medical. There have been some medical practices that today make no sense. I mean, we did stuff like bloodletting in the past, and I think any doctor who was alive during the bloodletting age, if they were alive today, they would be like, well, we did bloodletting and we really didn't learn a lot from the bloodletting. And in retrospect, it was a terrible idea.
Yep.
Maybe we learned a little bit about how blood courses through the body, and that was useful, and how much a person can bleed before they die. But,
we're getting pretty morbid here, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty morbid. But so, I mean...
Yeah, no, I understand, and I think this was, I got a number of comments on my post and on on different sites like Reddit and Hacker News, and I think this is one of the critiques or the questions, I guess, which is, hey, is programming that much different than other professions? And you have any profession. If I know I mentioned the medical field in my post a couple of times, just I don't know, just as an example, I guess, I found them similar because we're both kind of knowledge workers, right? We're both, we take data, we kind of make decisions. So I thought there were some parallels there. And I do think it's the case that other fields have, technology, and there are changes in the profession. But I guess I was wondering, and specifically at this conference and, afterwards, I wondered, is it the same, or is there a different in extent? Is it when I talk to friends and family and neighbors and things who are in different professions, of course they have different struggles and they have different kind of pros and cons in their profession. But this part of, being 40 and going to a conference and kind of gearing up and learning all new things does seem to be more unique. A doctor might have a new practice, or there might be new scientific knowledge that kind of affects how he might prescribe things. But I wonder, and again, I'm not a doctor, but I wonder if those things displace knowledge or if they build on the knowledge that person has. In our field, I feel like some of the knowledge is more displaced, like we are discarding knowledge that we had in favor of new things, new frameworks, new tools, new platforms. Whereas in other professions, maybe new techniques and or changes cause, kind of increase the total amount of knowledge, but don't cause people to kind of discard or have to discard what they knew.
Well, and I mean, in medicine, you would discard something like bloodletting over time. You would discard maybe the use of a drug that gets disproven, fen-phen for weight loss, for example. Like, okay, we're not going to prescribe fen-phen anymore. It wasn't a good idea. And, I guess the equivalent in programming is, I think you mentioned... What did you mention? JSPs or something like nobody uses these anymore. But you do, I mean, by having worked with JSPs, doesn't the very experience of having worked with JSPs, I mean, doesn't that give you some advantage? I mean, does that, the general experience of having programmed with the technology, I mean, it's almost like it doesn't matter what you have programmed with in the past, but the very aspect of that experience, that compounds in some sense. So you're never you may be throwing out the technology that you're working with, but we don't use horse-drawn carriages anymore. But somebody who spent a lot of time in the horse-drawn carriage industry probably has a lot of knowledge that is applicable in some other way.
Yeah, I do think so. I do think there is some carryover for sure. I was picking on, I think I mentioned in the post is GWT. So Google Web Toolkit, depending on how long people, your listeners have been in the industry.
I don't know what that is.
Exactly. And back in 2008, JavaScript was kind of it had a real a bad taste in people's mouth. It was kind of associated with a lot of spaghetti code, and it was dynamically typed, and it was kind of ugly in the early days. And so there's a big industry shift away from JavaScript towards technologies like GWT, which is Java that gets kind of compiled into JavaScript. So you're writing in Java. Other things like Flex and Flash and I believe Silverlight, but I hope I'm not wrong on this. I'm not. But other technologies were trying to build web applications without touching JavaScript. And this was a big deal back in 2008. And then I think collectively the industry realized that this was kind of a dead end, and lots of, newer and better technologies. There's a little, more robust things happened with JavaScript, nicer frameworks like Angular and now React and so forth. A lot of kind of innovation is happening in the JavaScript side. So anyways, long story short, like I think this little detour, I think your question was, did that help to go on that detour? Did that give me some better perspective that now in 2016, 8 years later, kind of helps me, be more effective building software? I think maybe to some extent it does. But yesterday I'm, working in the JavaScript tier, working with shims and polyfills and MD and libraries and all this whole new technology. And it doesn't help much, I don't think, in my perspective. It gives me maybe a better global view, but I don't think it helps quite as much.
The Insight Data Engineering program helps software engineers level up their careers. Data engineering is at the cutting edge of how we build software, and it involves some of the most interesting open source and distributed technologies, such as Apache Spark, Kafka, and NoSQL databases. Insight Data Engineering is free because they partner with top companies like Facebook, Uber, Capital One, and Slack. You can learn about data engineering at Insight Data Engineering. And if you go to insightdataengineering.com/sedaily, you can apply. Listeners of this show will be advanced straight to the coding challenge of the application process. If you get accepted, you get to learn how to build useful products in a self-directed program. There are workspaces in New York and Palo Alto that you can utilize during the short 7-week data engineering training process, and you have access to free cloud computing resources and a network of over 600 data engineers and data scientists from over 100 companies. Insight provides this support until you find a great data engineering position at a top company. Apply now at insightdataengineering.com/sedaily. Skip straight to the coding challenge. This is a special offer for Software Engineering Daily listeners. Thanks to Insight Data Engineering. And if you want to level up your career, if you want to learn some new skills and change what you are working on in your work environment, and perhaps get a job upgrade if you're looking for a different type of job, or if you're between academia and your career path and you want to build a little more skill before you jump on that career path, learn about data engineering at Insight Data Engineering. Go to insightdataengineering.com/sedaily to apply and skip straight to that coding challenge. And thanks again to Insight Data Engineering for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. You can also check out the interview I did with Insight Data Engineering several months ago on Software Engineering Daily. Let's get back to this episode. You mentioned that Java and JavaScript translation stuff. I'm sure people were very excited about that stuff around 2008 when we were like, oh, this is going to be a solution. Similarly, people are very excited about React Native right now. But when you look into, I've done some shows on React Native. It is really complicated. It's really complicated. It seems it's a super ambitious project, but I could, if one of your points of the article was to point out that you felt this sense of fatigue, I look at React Native sometimes and I'm like, man, I feel fatigued just looking at this. I don't see how this is ever going to work. It seems too ambitious. I don't know. It seems like there is like a certain trade-off. There's a certain balance that you have to develop as you're evaluating technologies, and you do have to have some measured sense of skepticism, and it's probably natural that skepticism grows over time when you've seen time and time again. I'm sure back when Google, when GWT came out, I'm sure their marketing materials were very attractive and it felt like GWT was the future. And when you get burned enough times by investing your beliefs into that kind of thing and you get burned by it, that can fatigue you.
Yeah, exactly. I think you said it way better than I did. Yeah, exactly. When you've been, around for a little while and you remember how excited you were when GWT came out, and you remember, just all the hype and all the buzz around this and everyone kind of jumping on the bandwagon, and you realize that it was a dead end. It can kind of fatigue you after a while, I think, and you're not quite as excited to jump on the next bandwagon if you perceive it to be a bandwagon. So I think you kind of maybe try to invest, you kind of back off on the trendy things and maybe try to invest in things that you think maybe are more stable.
Well, what's interesting about that is that in programming, especially as open source has become so big, it's not just like the bandwagon effect with, are you going to drink Coke or Pepsi? It's not like this just like coin flip, what's fashionable now sort of thing. It's more like if something gains a significant amount of momentum and other people start to latch onto it, even if it's this kind of project where it's like, okay, there's like a big vision, like React Native, for example, but we're not anywhere close to realizing the vision of what that is, the virtue of it becoming a bandwagon can make lots of open source contributors latch onto it, and then it actually reaches that potential. That's what's kind of interesting, is that, sometimes you could, this type of aggressive marketing or this visionary thinking, however you want to view it, can be quite beneficial. It can end up actualizing a technology just by virtue of the fact that it was so craftily marketed.
That's interesting. It kind of is self-fulfilling in some way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I have thought a bit about kind of the collective psychology of kind of bandwagons and what fuels that. Where I do think you see something that is kind of hot and has potential, and you want to, I think there's always a kind of a natural tendency to want to be associated with, things that are kind of new. I mean, I think it helps you in your career, the way you kind of brand yourself. You want to be someone who is forward thinking and trying new things. And so you see this next hot thing, which could be React Native, and you jump into that, and maybe you contribute to open source projects, or you maybe try to fit it in, kind of shoehorn it into your existing projects, and it builds this kind of momentum. Eventually, I think you get to the point where that is no longer cool or new, and the people who are there now in React Native want to then further be associated with what is new, and they kind of jump off the bandwagon and find something else new. And so there's this kind of psychology of fashion going on where the industry is constantly jumping to the things that are new for the sake of new. Again, I don't know enough about React Native to speak intelligently, and I hope that I don't get a lot of flames on React Native specifically, but just talking in general.
Well, that's okay. That makes two of us. I don't know a whole lot about it either. I've had some people on the show who have been in the industry a lot. I did a show with Brian Kernahan, who wrote a book. I think it's commonly referred to as K&R, about C. He's now working, I think, in Go a lot. And when I interviewed him, he was very humble about programming. He seemed to feel like he didn't have a great pulse on where things were going, but not to discredit him, he's a brilliant guy, but I think that it was just a show of his beliefs about how you should evaluate technologies, how you should think about technologies, was come at it with a sense of humility. You don't really know what's around the corner. And then in contrast, I think of another more seasoned programmer who I interviewed, Stephen Wolfram, and he seemed a little more opinionated about where things are and where things are going, and you see that in the technologies that he works on. The Wolfram language is what seems like a very opinionated language to me. So it's interesting because I'm referring to people who are older than you, and they have divergent opinions. I use those as examples to ask what when you have talked to other people who are even older than you, older programmers, what were their responses to your article about reflections of an old programmer?
Yeah, so I got I got a good amount of feedback, and I talked to friends who were older as well. First, I guess I should say, by calling myself an old programmer, I was being tongue in cheek.
I know, yeah.
I got a lot of comments. People say, "Hey, I'm 65 and I'm still programming. You're not old," and I'm like, I totally get that, and I am kudos to everyone who is still programming. Someone wrote he was in his 70s and he's still contributing to open source projects, and I think that's awesome, and I hope to be there someday and still feel as passionate. And I don't feel old. I was just kind of trying to communicate the point that it is possible in some points to feel old in this, maybe feel old in this profession when you really aren't old. But to your question, how did other people, kind of people older than me, kind of respond to it? I think what has impressed me most is the people I think that are still programming, that haven't bailed out to management or to sales or to other professions, that are still programming in their 50s and 60s. They don't worry about this stuff quite as much, it seems. They love programming. And this is the biggest kind of takeaway that from reading a lot of the comments and from talking to people is they love building things. They find some kind of nugget of enjoyment within programming, whether it's building things or solving problems or learning new technologies. That is kind of satisfying and meaningful to them. And that's what they focus on. And that's what keeps them engaged and excited to be in the field. And I think they have more skepticism about new frameworks. And if new frameworks, learning new things isn't something that is their kind of reason for being in programming, then that's not something that they try to keep up on. But they kind of, you end up finding the parts of the profession that you enjoy, and you focus on that. And I think that was kind of the best takeaway that I had from after writing the post and reading a lot of the feedback was kind of, feeling stressed about keeping up with the latest technology is probably not all that helpful. And instead, if you can just kind of focus on the parts that you enjoy, I think success will come.
Indeed. So in your 20 years of programming, we've seen this explosion of all kinds of new technologies that people are working with and building. But at the same time, our methods of distribution and communication have also increased. So, it's in some sense it's become harder to keep up. In another sense, it's become easier to keep up. Even as this horizon is expanding, the ways of keeping track of it are expanding as well. In that 20 years, do you feel like it's become easier or harder to keep up?
Honestly, I think you mentioned this before. I feel like it's harder. I definitely feel like there is more out there. 15 years ago, or when I first kind of came in the industry, there was just a smaller set of stuff that you felt, at least, that you needed to pay attention to. I've always kind of been in the Java world. And so, back in the early 2000s, it was just EJBs, and maybe there's one web framework called struts back then. And that was kind of the big deal. And basically, if you knew the EJB spec and you knew struts, I mean, you were kind of ahead of things. And you felt like you kind of had a decent grasp of where the industry was. And today I'm just kind of astonished and I don't know, there's just a lot more out there. I think every time I try to be more of a full stack developer, I try to have some basic understanding of a lot of the different tiers. And so I may dabble in just kind of looking into NoSQL databases or the data science kind of stuff and just kind of play around there. And then I jump back over into the UI and this, explosion like we talked about in JavaScript frameworks and innovations happening in the UI. And it's just every little pocket within, our programming field, there is just an enormous amount of innovation and new stuff and frameworks and things to know. And like you mentioned, there's, the way we stay on top of things, there's so many more outlets and blog posts and, back again 15 years ago, there was Dr. Dobbs, and that was what you read. You had your subscription to Dr. Dobbs and you felt like you're on top of things. And now I've got, a number of different, curated lists of links and things that I receive every week just to kind of keep my finger on the pulse if I can. And it's a lot. I think maybe that's why the post struck a chord with some people, because I feel like it's a lot for people, and it's easily to feel kind of overwhelmed.
Yeah, and this is not a great metric for how much things are increasing and fractaling and getting more complex, but I think I've noticed. So I started reading Hacker News like 3 years ago or so. I don't know. Do you read Hacker News? Okay, so I think most programmers do at this point. So I think I started reading it 3 or 4 years ago, and I think in that time, the entropy over a day of the articles on Hacker News has really picked up. And I don't know if that's just people who are using Hacker News or if it's an accurate benchmark of the pace of technology, but it just feels like you can refresh that site every 10 minutes and you're just like, oh my gosh, technology is moving really fast.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. And I think, swinging all the way back to the conference that I went to, I think it's, you have these, conferences that's just kind of culmination of it, right? Where you're physically around all these people and there's all these topics and all these sessions, and you feel these kind of simultaneous feelings of excitement and, about all this new stuff going on. And also just, like I mentioned, you just, could potentially be a little disheartened, because the flip side of that is that you are not in the know in a lot of these things. And so I guess it's kind of a struggle to keep balance, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. So getting back to your article, you said that there are two forces that are pushing against our ability to keep up. You were trying to codify what is causing this insistent feeling that we have inside that we cannot keep up. You talk about the knowledge decay and the knowledge accumulation rate. So knowledge decay, you give examples of two technologies that may have differing rates of decay. And the first technology you discussed is SQL. SQL is probably never going away. I mean, I hesitate to say never, but probably not. And then React Native will be around for who knows how long. It's easy to imagine circumstances developing where React Native perhaps fades away. But even if React Native fades away, maybe the concepts that React Native is built on will still be around. Maybe we'll still have some of the, I guess the declarative nature of React, that's more about React rather than React Native. So I'm not sure what the specific concepts we would retain from React Native would be. But nonetheless, it seems like working on SQL, perhaps you might have a more durable, accumulated knowledge. I don't know. How do you look at that problem of knowledge decay when you're deciding what technologies to work with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I was trying to, like you said, I was trying to kind of frame these questions of, okay, why is there this kind of ritual in programming where I have to, throw out some set of knowledge like on GWT and gear up for React Native, where in other professions this might not be the case. And so I thought, okay, well, let's just try to isolate it down to one variable. There's other professions that are knowledge workers. We're knowledge workers. What's the difference in the knowledge that we have versus the knowledge that they have? And so I just, and this is the beauty about blogging is that you don't need to fact check or have any data behind. You can these are just your thoughts. And so I thought about, well, the difference is that our knowledge kind of decays, right? There's some knowledge that there's a kind of a half-life that you could put on knowledge. And you could think about it that, in 10 years, and I just put a completely arbitrary stake in the ground, but in 10 years, I felt like, probably half my knowledge would be useless, would not be helpful. So the half-life of my knowledge is kind of I said in general of my knowledge is in programming is about 10 years. But I think, like you mentioned, if you kind of dissect it more, there's certain things within your kind of knowledge corpus or your knowledge base that have a longer half-life than others. Like SQL, I think obviously has a much longer half-life than probably some of the new JavaScript frameworks or so forth. So I think what was, I guess, helpful, what I was trying to kind of tease out was how can I kind of formalize this, and how can I think about things so that, what's a useful way of framing this so that I can kind of guide my career, and potentially focus on things that have a less of, a lower or a longer half-life.
Right. And the So that's knowledge decay. And the other concept you discuss is this knowledge accumulation rate, and this is the pace at which we add new things to our knowledge corpus. In some sense, we would expect the pace at which we add new things to our knowledge corpus to be related to the pace at which the overall horizon of new technologies is expanding. But in actuality, the rate at which new technologies are expanding and being created is accelerating, and our knowledge accumulation rate can't really accelerate, right? I mean, it's like probably kind of a static value. It's hard to, I don't know if you can learn more things at a faster rate. I mean, certainly, yeah. So, I mean, what's the relationship between this knowledge decay and knowledge accumulation? Is it like as there's more and more JavaScript frameworks and more databases and more distributed systems frameworks, do we have to throw out stuff faster? Do we have to increase our knowledge decay or our knowledge eviction rate and increase our knowledge accumulation?
That's interesting. And so I didn't think about kind of the point you're making, which is I was thinking about the knowledge accumulation rate is, hey, can I fill up my knowledge kind of corpus as fast as the stuff is decaying? And I didn't think about it necessarily in the sense that the overall amount of knowledge that could be accumulated is more, and so that has kind of implications on my knowledge accumulation rate as well. But that's a really interesting point. I just kind of was thinking basically, there's a rough threshold of knowledge in which you need to be effective to build software, and so given the fact that knowledge decays, is it possible to kind of accumulate enough knowledge to kind of compensate? And it kind of led me to the next part of the post, which was I put these two things together, this knowledge decay and knowledge accumulation rate, and kind of plotted it over the course of an average programmer's career, and kind of thought about things in the stages of your career and what how they impacted or how knowledge decay and kind of accumulation rates impacted you during those different stages.
Now, you described these three stages of a programmer. You had the eager apprentice stage, the rising star stage, and the steady veteran stage. These are three phases of mastery that a programmer goes through. Explain these three stages.
Sure. Yeah. And again, blogging is great because you can just come up with these stages.
That's true.
And that's just, within the context of that post, that's just how it is. So I just, again, kind of arbitrarily put these, thought about someone's career in terms of these three stages with respect to kind of knowledge decay and knowledge accumulation rate. And so the first stage, was, that kind of eager apprentice stage. You're just starting out in the industry and everything is shiny and new and exciting, and it's so exciting that you're in this field that you can start building things and people will use the things that you build right away. I always pick on the medical field, but if you're a doctor, you got to wait probably 10 years before you start, doing procedures that help people, or I could be wrong on the number of years, but you're not doing it right out of undergrad. But in programming, you can kind of jump in, get your hands dirty, you can contribute to a project right away, and it's really exciting. And what also is exciting is that you're learning so much. So every kind of new experience that is new accumulation of knowledge. And in the first few years, I gave it arbitrarily 5 years, say, none of your knowledge is really appreciably decaying. Everything that you've learned so far is still relevant, and every new day that you go in, you're learning something new, and it's all building into your kind of your knowledge base. And so it's kind of a really exciting time as a programmer. And I think that's why programmers are a lot of people go into programming when they're young, and it is kind of a skewed towards a younger person's field. Eventually you get out of that eager apprentice phase, and you're kind of, you're more self-sufficient, and you're, your way around. You're more confident once you probably can contribute to, a full spike of functionality in your application, say, like from top to bottom, and you don't really need as much mentorship or guidance. and you really establish yourself, people, your clients and your colleagues and your managers recognize you as someone who's competent and established themselves and can produce. And so it's at this point that I kind of said that there is it's also an exciting time, but it's also this kind of point of inflection that you don't realize, because it's at this point where when you start getting a little more recognition that these new expectations get placed on you, right? You have, or your company wants you to be more involved in interviewing other candidates, or they want you to kind of mentor the junior people and do more code reviews, or sit in more meetings, things that don't necessarily help you accumulate more new knowledge. They kind of use the knowledge you have and you're using it to benefit the organization or other people, which is a good thing for sure, but it kind of slows your accumulation rate. And the other thing is that around this time, you've been in the industry 7-10 years, some of your knowledge starts to decay. And so the overall knowledge, where it was kind of linear growth in the first stage, it starts to kind of peter off. It's still, an upward trajectory, but it starts that, you're not kind of adding quite as much new stuff, and maybe some stuff is decaying. So those are kind of the first two stages. And the last stage was you get to this point where you've been in the industry for 15 years, you have probably a lot more expectations on you. And so you actually maybe peak at some point with the amount of useful knowledge that you have. Some of the knowledge, like my knowledge in GWT, it's gone, it's useless, and it's not helping me anymore. And so in terms of my overall knowledge, it might be less now than it was 5 years ago. And you kind of reach this point of recognition where, because of these two forces, because some of my knowledge is decaying, and because I don't have the ability to acquire as much new knowledge to compensate all the time, I kind of plateau, or I may kind of, there might be some kinds of ebbs and flows in my overall knowledge, past the age of 35 or 40, I said, just again, arbitrarily.
The Serconis monitoring and analytics platform is a leader in accurate monitoring and custom analytics for any tech at any scale. For 6 years, Serconis has given engineers the tools that they need to understand the behavior of their systems, whether it's leveraging anomaly detection and alerting tools to quickly adapt to unexpected changes, or accessing the flexible analytics solutions to plan your resource allocation. Serconis is the go-to platform that enables you, the engineer, to answer the questions that support your problem-solving goals. If you want to learn about how to better understand the behavior of your systems with a monitoring tool that you can trust, go to serconis.com/sedaily for your free trial. Serconis is built by and for engineers, and they know that inaccurate data from monitoring tools can lead to bad decisions. And that's why their platform stores data using histograms, which enables recall of the entire distribution of data. It's not just compressed or averaged data for your alerting. You get accurate alerting and reporting data that you can trust. This method is not used by most competitors in the monitoring space, many of whom may not even guarantee an accurate measurement for a 99% service level agreement, let alone the service level agreements that your customers require of you, which may be higher than 99%. Again, to check out Serconis, go to serconis.com/sedaily. It would support the show, and you would get a free trial. Serconis offers smarter monitoring for smarter engineers. Check it out at serconis.com/sedaily. Thanks to Serconis for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. We really appreciate it. So there's the rising star phase where you're accumulating knowledge quickly. You have a sharp slope to how much your knowledge base is increasing, and then you hit this point where you go to there's the eager apprentice phase, and that's where you're rising sharply. And then there's the rising star stage where you're slowing down a little bit in terms of how quickly you're learning, because maybe you're getting pulled into meetings and stuff, and just these things that are impinging on your learning rate, and then you get to the steady veteran stage. And this is what I want to talk about. The steady veteran stage is this phase you describe where, you get later on in your career, instead of increasing the knowledge, you just end up in this dynamic equilibrium where you've effectively plateaued, and it's just your knowledge is kind of going up and down and up and down as the tides of technology turn and certain technologies get outdated. And so that, to me, seems an undesirable state. So for a veteran programmer who has been in the industry for a long time, and they're starting to notice, they look back on their last 2 or 3 years and they're like, oh no, I've plateaued, I'm in this dynamic equilibrium state. There's got to be some way to get out of that, right? Like, there's got to be some way to get back to the place where you're constantly learning, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think, I had friends who read the post who are my age. They're like, dude, you really depressed me there.
I know. That's what I was thinking. I was like, man, this is kind of cynical.
Yeah, it is. Right, exactly. And I didn't mean it to be so simple. But I do think there was some kind of, I guess there was some cynicism there but there's also maturity, I think, that you reach in the steady veteran stage where, in your early part of your career, you just imagine this, linear growth all the way up until you're 60 years old, and you're just going to be this programming god, because at that point, every year, the amount of knowledge, if you kind of track the amount of knowledge you're learning month over month, it's just up and to the right. It's just amazing. That kind of trajectory is just, it's just awesome. But you do get to a point, I think, when you're kind of a veteran where it does kind of tail off a little bit. And I think there are absolutely things that you can do to kind of keep that trajectory going up and keep accumulating useful knowledge and stuff that helps you and keep getting better and better and improving at what you're doing. But I do think, I guess for me, it was helpful to kind of step back and try to appreciate what these forces were so that I could kind of break out of this equilibrium state. One of the things I do think, though, and I've seen this often, is if you don't kind of appreciate that your knowledge decays and you don't appreciate the impact of extra obligations on you from the organization, that you can slip into this steady state, and it can be not as satisfying. And a lot of people, I think, at this point kind of bail out and go into management or go into something, kind of another pocket in the field. So I do think you have to be kind of mindful of this so that you can sometimes say, you know what? I don't want to manage. I want to be a programmer. I want to be an expert in the field. I want to be able to, be, I don't know, perceived as an expert and keep improving. And so I'm not going to take on these extra obligations that are going to take away from my ability to kind of accumulate more knowledge. So I think there are. And then the other thing, the other kind of takeaway was that, yeah, there is some knowledge that decays faster than others, like we talked about. And so maybe I should focus on knowledge that is more durable so that it is more cumulative than something that's going to decay. And I think a lot of people wrote in and were kind of giving examples of things in their career that have been more cumulative than decaying. Knowledge of algorithms, knowledge of kind of patterns and best practices, and in certain pockets in the field too. In data science, there's I think a lot more depth in math and science and things, or math and statistics that are not going to change quite as much. So I do think if you appreciate these things, it doesn't have to be so dismal.
Yeah, no, I in the algorithms perspective, for example, like these, I've been doing some shows recently about these, about schedulers and just like different kinds of schedulers. And there are many schedulers in the infrastructure ecosystem right now. When I say infrastructure ecosystem, I mean like these distributed systems frameworks like Mesos and Kubernetes, and it's funny because, schedulers was something that I learned about in school, and I kind of was just like, okay, I don't ever see these things in the programming that I'm doing, or I didn't see them much. There's some toy academic applications, but our professors would always say, you're going to see these things over and over again. And then, now I'm at this point where I'm doing a bunch of shows on them. I'm like, oh, it's true. Like, scheduling is a really big deal. And at the same time, the field of schedulers is so deep, just the abstract concept of schedulers. You could go really deep on schedulers, and it's probably something that's durable, and it's going to compound interest as you learn it over time. So when you step back and you take a look at this career landscape and you look at how your own career has evolved, what are the other high-level takeaways as a programmer that has been in the industry for 20 years?
Sure. Yeah, I think I kind of mentioned in the beginning, I think the biggest takeaway for me was to maybe stop fretting quite as much about these, the not keeping up, and just focus on the parts of the profession that you do love. I think it's very easy, like we mentioned, to kind of get overwhelmed by how much is out there and how much you don't know. But at the end of the day, most of us are building software for real people and real customers. And those real customers don't care quite as much about the underlying frameworks. They care about whether the software does what they want it to do. And if I can use jQuery just as effectively for my client, for a specific application, then they're going to be just as happy versus trying out the latest and greatest. And so I think if we kind of keep those kind of feelings of being overwhelmed at bay and focus on what we're doing, the parts that we do enjoy, and the output of what we're doing, the actual the product of what we're building. I think that's something that does it is something that gives a lot of satisfaction and meaning to what we do, and you can kind of stop worrying. And if you do that right, then you're going to have a long, happy career in this field. I think if you focus on the stuff that we're building and keeping their customers happy, I think in the end that was kind of my biggest takeaway.
Do you work on side projects?
I used to, and then I had kids.
See, and now we have uncovered the source of your cynicism.
Probably true.
No, honestly, I find that side projects are the road to spiritual renewal as a programmer.
That's interesting. Yeah. So why do you say that?
Well, it's because with a side project, you really get to. I mean, you don't have to be encumbered by. I mean, it lets you get back at the roots of, those first days of programming where, you go from Hello World to like making some text-based game, and you're just doing it, on your own. Maybe you build some small web app that does something stupid that you just needed it to do. Those are my fondest memories of programming, are those times where I'm just like hacking by myself, and I'm working on a side project, and I'm learning something new, and I get to build things exactly how I want. I don't have to worry about unit tests or integration tests or branching strategies or any of this stuff that you have to do as an industrial programmer. You really just kind of get to, paint on an empty canvas. And I know that's not all that there is to programming, but for me, I always found that very, like, I got an artistic, sort of a solo artistic sense out of it, and I always found it very fun, and I found that to be a very good way to learn new technologies in a way that was pleasurable. Like that. If I were going to learn React Native today, I would be like, okay, well, I'm going to learn it on a side project, not going to learn it in an industrial context.
Yeah, absolutely. I had done in my earlier in the 20s and early 30s, I did do a number of side projects, things that were fun to learn a specific technology, or things that I wanted to, little applications that might be helpful for me or helpful for a friend with a small business or something like that. And I think you're right. There is a lot of, when there's fewer constraints, you don't have to worry about integrating with, hundreds of thousands of legacy lines of legacy code that you have to understand. And, unit tests and integration tests. I think there is probably, you can get back to, stuff that is more pleasurable or more fun. I think that's a good point. I think, Sorry.
Well, no, a kid is a side project too, probably for some people.
Absolutely. I think, probably the last thing to say is that, having kids and it is amazing, and probably some of maybe the you see this these other things happening that are really important in your family life, and so it kind of puts in perspective some of the you may not have quite as much energy to jump on the React Native bandwagon because you're going to coach your kid's soccer game right after, and there's other stuff that you're focusing on, and so so maybe that contributes as well. But in the end, I hope when I have free time, I love tinkering and doing side projects, and No,
and I'm sure once those kids get to a certain age, you'll be tinkering with them, and I'm sure that'll be a very enjoyable thing to do.
Yeah, I hope so, definitely.
So we've got some things coming down the pike, like IoT, voice interfaces, virtual reality. I think blockchain technology may fit this category. We have all these things coming down the pike that look like platforms that are totally new, that are going to be as impactful as mobile was. And we started out this conversation basically talking about how you felt like you missed the mobile boat. I think we've got like 4 or 5 areas coming down the pike that are as big as mobile. And I mean, do these types of advances, do you look at these types of things and you're like, well, I need to try to keep up with all of these, or do you just start to think like, okay, it's time to put down a stake in the ground and say, I am going to specialize in X. I'm not going to try to be somebody who's good at virtual reality programming and good at IoT and good at mobile and good at web. Do you have to put down a stake, or do you maybe like put down a stake and then still kind of like keep your fingers out prodding other stuff? How do you handle it because I feel like, we've been talking about this basically fractal nature of how the topics that are being explored in programming is expanding and becoming harder to keep up with. I feel like it's about to get even harder, like exponentially harder.
Now you're bumming me out. Just joking.
Well, I'm excited about it as a podcaster because I don't actually have to learn any of the difficult parts of it. I can just stay skin deep. It's very exciting for me.
No, I do think it is exciting. I think it's exciting, and there was a great analogy back in the Pragmatic Programmer. I think a book that was written a long time ago, but I think still people read it. It was talking about your kind of knowledge as you think of it as an investment portfolio where you might buy a couple blue chip stocks. So that might be your specialization where you're kind of digging in on, I'm going to be a mobile guy, but then you use some, you make some small investments in maybe some riskier things. And so you kind of balance your portfolio a little bit, and you probably do specialize a little bit because, to be effective you probably need some specialty. It's tough to be a jack of all trades. But you also kind of, balance that portfolio a little bit and try to dabble a little bit and kind of keep aware of things so that if the industry does shift, at least you have some sense of where it's going and what might be fruitful. But I think the great thing about our field, probably the thing that we've been talking about that is you can see it as distressing or you can see it as exciting, which is if you miss one train, there's going to be another train coming in, a couple months. And so if you miss mobile, there's going to be some new field that you could probably jump into and contribute to and get up to speed on and develop some expertise there. So, I think there's lots of optimism for that, in that we are in a field that changes a lot, and that's what's exciting about it.
Absolutely. Well, Ben, I think I want to wrap up on that note, and I really enjoyed talking to you. I really enjoyed your post. It was a great reflection on somebody who was experienced in the industry, and I felt like it was well balanced. There were, obviously you could take cynical interpretations from it. You could take other kinds of interpretations from it, but overall, I walked away from it with a very, it was reflective, which is the name of the article was Reflections of an Old Program. It was reflective. So I really enjoyed reading it.
Hey, thanks so much. And thanks so much for having me.
Thanks to Symphono for sponsoring Software Engineering Daily. Symphono is a custom engineering shop where senior engineers tackle big tech challenges while learning from each other. Check it out at symphono.com/sedaily. That's symphono.com/sedaily. Thanks again, Symphono.
Wow!